court. So we are here together again, and this will be our third video together. So who would like to go first? Jamie, want to tell us?
I think my mom should go first. This is her project.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
I'm a retired California judge, and this is my 5th history book we're talking about, which just came out in September. The Lindbergh kidnapping, suspect number 1, the man who got away.
Well, just before, you ended a little bit too soon. You're a judge in what county? And
well, I was the presiding judge of the California State Bar Court, which oversees all the attorney discipline in California. I was the first one from 1989 to 1995, and after that, I did arbitration and mediation. And for since about 2012, I've been publishing books. History books.
Right, and just mention the people that you've written about, because that's absolutely fascinating. I love all these suspects, all these people. I never read books about them. I mean, I never heard of Phaedra until I
got interested in writing when I joined the board of the California Women Lawyers, because one of the founders was a woman named Faye Stender, who was a pioneering criminal defense lawyer. And she had a tragic death, and no one had really written her full biography. There were, she had been written about, but not a full biography. So I started researching that, and I found that the case that made her the most famous internationally was her sitting as co-counsel in a death penalty trial in 1968 for the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton. And it was an internationally watched trial. He was expected to be executed for the death of a policeman, but where both of them had been wounded, and one other policeman had been wounded, but there were no other witnesses to come forward to, well, there were actually some people who thought they saw parts of it, but they did not have a clear picture of exactly what happened. And she pioneered work on implicit bias, working with sociology professors at Cal, and worked really hard to come up with questions to seat a jury that was less biased than normal. And for 200 years, the United States had in its constitution that you were, as a defendant, criminal defendant, you would sit before a jury of one's peers. But one's peers tended to be white men only. Right. Historically. And they were determined, she and her co-counsel were determined to seat a diverse jury. And they wound up doing that. They seated 7 women, 4 minorities, one of whom was African-American, he was a banker. And the jury chose him as the foreman, the first Black foreman of a major murder trial in America. And it made a difference. So the diversity in the jury is huge. And today we kind of take it for granted in many jurisdictions. And yet it really got a jump start in this one case. So I wound up publishing a book about that first before I published Faye Stender's biography. And that book was The Sky's the Limit in 2012. And what I did was I compared the Newton case, which she thought was one of the preeminent cases of the 20th century, to other famous trials that were called the trial of the century, of which there are more than 50, I think. And I found that no list that I could see listed in the top 40 the Newton trial. And that was surprising to me. And yet there was an overlap. Different lists had different cases included, but there was an overlap. So I took the top 20 on the overlap that they were all saying were trials of the century. And I compared them to the Newton trial. And I found the Newton trial was way more important. I mean, the diversification of the jury for criminal defendants, what happened was that a lawyer in Berkeley wrote up the results of that case, the arguments made, the voir dire of the jury, the questioning of the jury, and it became the Bible, that manual became the Bible for criminal defense lawyers nationwide. Mm-hmm. So it was a huge difference in that one case. And I looked at some of these others, and it was only because there were celebrity defendants or celebrity was involved. Right. There weren't very many that had important issues.
Right.
And they didn't compare. And so what happened was, I wrote the book, The Sky's the Limit, People versus Newton, the Real Trial of the 20th Century. And among the cases was the Lindbergh case that was on everybody's list. And it was the only case that I found from that part of the, well, at all really, where there was still a lot of concern and question about whether justice was done and whether they found out the truth. And that was
the Hauptmann case.
Right, the Hauptmann case, yeah. The kidnap murder trial that resulted in Bruno Richard Hauptmann being executed. And I saw that to this day, there were especially legal scholars who consider the trial exceedingly unfair. And yet that still left doubts about what was Hauptmann's role, if any.
Right.
And that got me curious, because I couldn't even write a chapter comparing it to the Newton trial without a sense as a judge of where I stood on this.
Yeah.
I didn't want to say some people say this and some people say that without having a feel for which side I thought justice prevailed on. And so I did a lot of research back then to get myself acquainted with it, reading a lot of the books about it, and also doing original research in Minnesota at the Historical Society, and talking to the archivist, Mark Falzini, talking to Lloyd Gardner back then. And actually, after I drafted a chapter, I ran it by both of them to make sure that I was as accurate as I could be. And then I considered writing a book and started writing a book about that case. But then I put it aside to complete Faye Stender's biography and to write 2 other books. So.
Right. I'm anxious to read your Faye Stender book and the Huey Newton book, because I remember those days of the Black Panther movement. But my brain has become so fuzzy about my hippie days in Greenwich Village. I mean, they were a big part of society and culture at the time. It's a very important, the whole topic is very important. I mean, who was it? They shot him in the bed while he was asleep. Fred Hampton. Murdered in his bed. I mean, they planted the gun on him. Those were the local Chicago cops who did that, or was it the FBI?
Well, it was a combination. It was actually a combination of the FBI and the Chicago police, right. And ultimately the family won the biggest civil damage award that had been given out in Chicago until then, when the truth came out about what really happened.
Wasn't it the committee that outed that? What's it called? The committee after the Watergate scandal, church committee.
Church committee? It may have been part of what the church committee did. I recall there was a special commission, and I'm trying to remember the name of the former attorney general who was involved in it, but he was instrumental in writing the report about that case. So I'm not sure it was part of the church. I mean, some of it may have come out from the church committee, but I'm not sure. They certainly exposed a lot about what happened to the Panthers in the church committee.
Right, that's how I remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in any event, what I found with Faye Stender was that this was only one of the many things she was involved in. She was a part of a group in Berkeley and Oakland that were the leaders of the movement, as they called it, in various directions. I mean, they were against the war, and Berkeley and Oakland were at the hub of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. They got involved in civil rights issues early on in the 60s. They went down to Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama in the summers in the 60s. So following her life was also following what this group was doing. They worked for Cesar Chavez before he had any attorneys of his own. Various issues.
So,
Yeah, that's what I love. Well, Jamie, I want you to tell us about yourself, but this is so fascinating. I skipped over it
sure.
previously.
Yeah.
Do you want to
Well,
say something?
well, my first involvement with the Lindbergh book, at my mom's request, was when she was doing research like 10 years ago or a little longer than that ago. And she had asked me if I wanted to join her, I think at the New Jersey State Police Museum. I was like, yeah, I'd love to. That sounds really interesting. You know, I'd love to help with that. So, um, so I did a little bit of research with her back then when I was, I think the summer of after my, uh, one of the years in college, I forget which year, but
You've
but
been to
I did.
college so much. You want to tell everybody how much college you've, how many degrees? You're a paralegal.
Oh no, well,
Tell us.
I've only got two. I've got my undergrad and my paralegal degree, and I'm working on the second associates in investigations right now. So it's not that many, but
Investigations.
yeah,
Your associate's degree is going to be in
associate's
forensic.
degree in criminal justice investigations. Yeah,
Great.
that's what I'm working on right now. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you became interested because your mom went to New Jersey.
Yeah, I
Who
mean,
invited you to come to New Jersey with her?
yeah, well, I think we were there visiting my sister, and my mom was in town, and she was doing research in New Jersey, and it's like, hey, we should, I'll totally go with you to check it out. I'm curious about this. This is the Lindbergh case. Of course, I'm interested. Who wouldn't be interested?
Right.
And at that point, I didn't know much about it other than that Lindbergh was famous. I wasn't really sure. I mean, I know he was a pilot. I didn't really know the extent of his fame. I just knew that he was really famous at the time, and that his son had been kidnapped. I didn't even know that until my mom's research, until we did the research at the Jersey State Police Museum, that they had found a body. Like I knew that,
Right.
I knew that Hauptmann had been executed, but I didn't know that that they had found a body. Or the particulars of it, because I'd always heard, well, you know, the stories about people coming forward later saying, I'm Lindbergh baby, I'm the Lindbergh baby, because you know, there's that cultural, you know, like in TV or you know, references in pop culture about people coming forward saying, you know, the long lost Lindbergh baby. So I never knew that they had found a body until, you know, doing this research. So
but
a lot of things
your mom is correct, I'm sure. I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a historian, but I am sure that of all the crimes of the century that take that name over the years, over the centuries, that there is none other that has so many unanswerable questions, that has no other, like your mom was just saying, she wasn't sure she got all the things right. She passed it to Mark Falsini because it's a case in which everything could be contested. You just open your mouth for 5 seconds and say something. There's somebody who can come along and say, oh, no, you're wrong. This isn't right. It happened differently. Or I don't think there's any other case. What does your mom think?
I don't, I haven't done, I mean, go ahead, Mom.
Oh, I just wanted to say that in both of that book and this book, I take pains to say that any mistakes in it are mine. I'm not going to say that I listened to everything that Mark Falsini said or that he offered advice on it, any of my opinions, but he was helpful in pointing out a couple of factual mistakes that were based on FBI reports at the time. That I assumed they knew what they were talking about, and
I was just going to say
he taught me not to make that assumption.
Right.
Well, the problem is that the deeper you dig, and I think Michael Melsky, who's another big researcher who's written several books on this case, who's done a tremendous amount of research on this case. It's the deeper you dig, the more convoluted it becomes, because a lot of the original documentation, a lot of the official documents are conflicting. And so you have to take into consideration, you can't just take everything at face value, because you have to realize the context and who had control of the investigation, and whether or not anybody writing that document had reason to lie, or anybody testifying had reason to lie. And so that this is something, as a paralegal, that's been tremendously helpful for me, to just, it reinforces, you know, the investigative techniques that I'm starting to learn, that you can't take everything at face value, even if they're original documents, because you have to take everything into context, because people can lie.
And they sometimes lie without realizing it as well. They have, I mean, how many times have I told my husband, my glasses are in the kitchen, you want to give them to me? Oh, they're not in the kitchen. Well, you know, after an hour of this, you find out they're actually in the bedroom. And I always say to myself, thank goodness I'm not on a jury, and I'm not relying on my memory because memory, I think we all know, is the least valuable aspect of well,
eyewitness identification is really faulty.
Right.
That's something they now teach, and they now explain to a lot of juries.
But in the kidnap case that we're talking about, supposed kidnap case, it was considered to be high value,
highly reliable. Right. And it shouldn't have been, when especially because there weren't safeguards. When somebody who's an alleged witness is taken to the jail to look at this fellow with not in a lineup and say, don't you recognize him, and he's the guy, you're imprinting his appearance on them, and he didn't even have a lawyer present. So you have this combination of very suggestive circumstances that wouldn't be allowed anymore.
You're referring to Jaffe, when they brought him to Greenwich Street and they said...
Not just Jaffe, it was also the three eyewitnesses from Hopewell. They were allowed to come to the jail also.
Oh, I didn't know that.
My recollection is that all three of them did. I certainly know that the elderly man was brought to the jail to look at it.
Hochmuth and Whitted, those two guys.
His name was, I'm trying to remember his name.
Hochmuth and Whitted.
Hochmuth, yes.
But there were also the clerks who had recently reported a suspicious man spending gold certificates that turned out to be ransom money at their shops, just right after Hauptmann was arrested, or right around the time that Hauptmann was arrested. And they brought those three people, was it Levatino, and I forget the two other people, but they clerks who had recently received gold certificates from a man who the police at the time thought matched Jaffe's description of Cemetery John. And they brought all three of them to the jail cell as soon as Hauptmann was arrested to identify Hauptmann as that person without a lineup. And all three of them, according to the papers back then, said they couldn't identify him. Mm-hmm. But that was without a lineup. That was just him in the jail cell. Right. So you have that bias that if somebody's in a jail cell, they must be guilty.
Exactly.
Or at least, have the impression. Right. And so you had that too. But yeah.
Speaking of Levatino, who takes a large part of your book, I don't remember reading about him before I read your book. Let me ask you something. I have a friend who studies the money on this issue, and that's the one part of Hauptmann's story that I have difficulty with, because he didn't work after after April 1932. He hardly worked. He was gambling in stock exchange So yes. So what do you think of how the trial went into? Well, here's what I want to ask you, because I was just reading Hauptmann's letter to David Wilentz. I forgot where I saw it. It wasn't in your book. And he asked David Wilentz. This was days before his electrocution. He's saying to David Wilentz how innocent he is, and how could you, and I'm paraphrasing it, how could you show the jury that I spent 49, 9, whatever, spent all of the $50,000, and yet people came to my jail cell asking me, where did you hide the rest of the money? Where is the other $36,000? In other words, they're asking him, where did you hide $36,000? But at his trial, they showed the jury that he spent entirely $50,000.
Well, actually, my recollection is that that was one of the least credible parts of the prosecution's case from the perspective of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover thought their tracing of that money was ludicrous.
Oh.
So he had a couple of agents at the trial every day reporting back to him what was going on. They didn't really trace it all to him, and there was money being spent during the trial, and there was money spent after the trial, and they stopped tracking it because they didn't want the distraction from what the case they were trying to prove. So there was other money out there. They knew it. In fact, in the Curtis case, Curtis was convinced he was dealing with the real gang because they showed him money that came from the ransom. It had already been published in the newspapers what the numbers were, and they're showing him that they had some of it.
Oh, I don't
know. So there are lots of questions about that money, but the case, it didn't convince J. Hoover at all that he had spent it all. They really did not tie most of the money to him. For example, the $3,000 or nearly $3,000 that was spent, that was cashed in May, the last day it was legal to do so in 1933, was somebody entirely different. His handwriting didn't match Hauptmann's. And
he signed his name Faulkner.
Yeah. Well, he signed his name Faulkner. They never traced anybody who really owned up to that name.
No.
So that was a mystery man who had at least $3,000 of that. There was other evidence that Isidore Fish spent some of the ransom money on a ticket to Germany on his ship passage. Spent it in November 33 for his December 33 ticket. So there are a lot of open questions about what happened to that money. And that part of the trial was not, I think, particularly credible.
Should we talk about I'm sorry, Mom, do you want to talk? Is it okay if I talk about Borelli or no?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Well, so in the book, Mom talks about that there was an affidavit that was part of Governor Hoffman's follow-up investigation that HOAG had conducted in like 37, 38. And there was a report from a ship's who had a ship's purser who had been a ship's purser, meaning they were the ones handling the money of the people that came on the ship, the passengers, and the valuables of the people that came on the ship. And this guy, his name is Pastorelli, is the name of the purser, and he said in April of 32. April, was it 8th or 9th or something like that? He said that there was this man, a very suspicious man who, tall man who had 3 passports, but no visa, acting very suspiciously and talking about how he was excited that the Lindbergh kidnapper was on board the ship, and he had in his possession $30,000 in small bills. And he turned it, and the reason that the person knew that is because the guy wrote the amount on the envelope before giving it to him so he could make sure he got his money back. But this was a ship that was bound for, I think, Chile. And the passenger had come from New York. And the man was on the ship with $30,000 bound for Chile. So, and according to the trial, approximately $30,000 was unaccounted for.
Well,
so, yeah.
They did say they accounted for every penny to put him in the electric chair. They did.
Well, but that the FBI didn't believe it. You know, I think the FBI, their records showed, the FBI records showed that only about 20,000 was accounted for. So according to FBI records, about 30,000 was unaccounted for. And so I think there's also testimony at the trial by one of the investigators that said they'd only tracked about $20,000 directly, recovered 20,000. I mean, I think there's information out there. It's just, if it was spent abroad, you know, it's probably gone by now.
Well, if Hauptmann even had, the whole thing is ridiculous to think of, because if what they said at his trial was correct, how does a person like him, living in the house he was living in, the neighborhood he was living in, how do they spend $36,000 in less than 3 years?
Exactly.
I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. And why he didn't move, if he were the killer and the owner of that much money, well, why didn't he just move over to Madison Avenue somewhere, or I don't know, San Francisco?
Exactly. And why would, and again, another thing about that, about just the I don't know if absurdity is the right word to use, but I can't think of a better one. If he really was, you know, as involved as, you know, he was charged to be and convicted of being, why would he take one rail from his attic, his landlord's attic that he didn't even own? Why, if he had access to wood in his shop, if it would not have been suspicious for him to buy wood at any lumber yard, but it definitely would be suspicious, you know, to take a piece of wood from a house you don't even own, you know, just to make one rail of a ladder. There's so many things about that argument that really don't make sense for somebody who's supposed to be a very smart, you know, crafty criminal.
Right. Well, besides that, the makeshift ladder was so poorly constructed, it couldn't hold the weight of a man with a child. So that was something the police figured out right away, that it could only hold about 125 pounds without cracking. And that included a baby, not a baby, a toddler who weighed 27 to 30 pounds.
Right.
So it was not, it was, the first responders pretty quickly assumed this was an inside job and that was a ruse. And a couple of those first responders were removed right away.
Yeah.
They had to have been, because they were asking the wrong questions. And do you remember who they were? I think Mike.
Yes. Well, the police chief from Hopewell, he technically didn't have jurisdiction, but he was the first person called to the scene, Harry Wolf. Also, Oscar Bush, who was a tracker who had been a deputy sheriff before and was very astute. And he saw footprints leading to the Featherbed Lane behind the house. He was one who noticed that the ladder didn't make sense. He also, one of the things he noticed was that if you saw a picture of that yard, which I included in the book, it's overgrown and ungraded. And it was very wet that night, very muddy and wet. And yet the path that was taken, that Oscar Bush traced, went kind of in an L-shaped path. It went east and then south. And what's interesting about that is apparently he tracked the last part of that person's journey to Featherbed Lane, where there were car tracks, along car tracks that went from the Lindbergh's driveway across the yard. So he said somebody had to know that terrain really well to know that there was a safer path to walk on than all the tall grass around, because it was actually easier to walk where there had been a car driven across before.
Well, I have to tell you that while you were speaking, Lisa, I heard every word you were saying, but I had a different screen. Were you looking at the same screen that I'm looking at? Did you see anything different for a minute? Because I got the warning to upgrade.
Oh.
Time
no, we saw nothing. We saw nothing else.
Nothing different. Well, I don't know if the viewers, if that was recorded, the screen changed and it's asking me to upgrade. I think it's going to shut itself off again. I don't know why, because I said it properly, but
I think it's 40 minutes. I think it's been about 40 minutes again.
Yeah. Oh, I see that the countdown is 8:05. So we've got eight minutes to go, and then we will do a second part. This is ridiculous. I'm going to have to upgrade in the end. Okay. So Lisa, you would, I'm sorry that I interrupted you, but
that's okay.
The other thing that I hope within 7 minutes I can ask the question, but you may not be able to answer it. Someone else this week asked me a question that blew my mind because I'd never thought of it. Betty and Anne was supposedly struggling with the shutters. Now, if you look at the window that's supposed to be the window that the ladder was put up against and someone climbed through, it has a trunk and then a valise on a suitcase on top of the trunk. Supposedly there was a beer stein on the window, but I don't remember that part. How in the world this person asked me, Nancy Attardo asked me to ask you, how would Betty and Anne reach out of the window with those trunks in the way and reach the shutters from the outside of the house? Was there something wrong with their statement? Were they lying? How in the world would you lean over those? You know what? Can you picture the window?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can answer that. I do know that the shutters were removed by the police shortly afterward to be tested. Ellis Parker said that he learned from the police that they had actually been jimmied by like a screwdriver. That was what he understood, that it wasn't the chisel. But they were never seen again. So that's only his statement, and it's secondhand. But the shutters never came back. Right. And the police never reported on what happened to them. The problem that they had with those shutters started in February, and they actually closed them every day, supposedly, all the windows. And so that one they'd had trouble with for just a few weeks. And the person who created the house, you know, the master carpenter, had been there and testing them all and said there's no way they were worked. Since I signed off on the project in December, it's only been a couple of months. And one of the things that Lloyd Gardner notes is that Lindbergh made a complaint about a problem with the main door sill, I think, to a different worker, and never criticized and never called the guy back and said, hey, we need to fix this shutter that they can't close on a daily basis. Now, I'm not sure. Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
I'm sorry, I want to jump in there. I think what she's asking is if there was all that stuff there in the way, how could they have closed the shutters? And I think without knowing what the dimensions are, it's hard to make an assessment about whether it would block them from trying to close those shutters. So you have to know how tall they were and how tall that pile was.
But they did try to use up until from October until through January. They had been there a few times. They were there in October. They were there for a few weekends in January. And apparently did not have that difficulty. So it's something that they had done before, as far as I could tell.
Right. But in the photographs of the nursery from the night of the missing child, you can see, I looked at the picture just a few hours ago to make sure it was the right window. There's a trunk, and then on top of it is a suitcase, and it's quite, it's at least, I don't know, 18 inches out from the window. They would have had, and the shutters are on the outside of the house. They're not within the room. So how would they have leaned over? Anne wasn't that big of a person, neither was Betty.
I honestly don't know. I don't know what their procedure was.
Right.
I think we'd have to do some more research to figure out if they used a tool like a hook or something to grab the shutters in. We'd have to do more research on that.
Yeah. There'd be no reason for them to lie. There'd be no reason.
No,
for them.
There wasn't, and they spoke about it that night. That they said that they couldn't get it latched. One of the reasons, what they did with the French window, which was closer to the crib, was to keep the window open a little bit for a little ventilation, but keep the shutters closed.
Yeah. Well, it's that whole scenario, no matter which scenario I visit, in this case that went on for so many years, I'm always ending back in that room. I always end up back in the nursery room because that's the most interesting to me. The things that went on immediately at the time the child wasn't in the crib and the hour before, and that's really the most important observations we can make about why we even bother to look into anything else, because everything is so strange. He claimed he heard wood breaking in the kitchen. No one else heard. He was probably deaf.
He didn't claim that the night of.
Right. I know. Many months later, or maybe
a week and a half later.
Week and a half later.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have 2 minutes left before we go to our next segment. So anybody want to say something for a minute?
Well, I'm not sure whether we can do that second one today because of Jamie's schedule. So Jamie?
Yeah, I wish I could. But they're about to come back. So, and I don't want to, So I would really like to continue this, maybe whenever you guys are free again. But it was a really great conversation, and if you have more questions for us, I'd love to participate again.
I'll just have to upgrade. I thought I could get away with it. I don't have too many people that I interview at the same time, but maybe this will be a new thing. I'll have a whole panel here. Gregory Algren and Steve Monier are going to talk to me, so maybe we could have five of us on the screen.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Fun, right? Yeah. So be well, both of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the book. I keep reading the book. I've learned so much from you, both of you. I have.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and we'll be talking again.
Thank you so much, Ronelle.
You're welcome. Take care. Be well. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.